For years, this story was fueled by voices, confessions, documentaries, threats of dark truths. But in the last few days, the most powerful thing in this entire saga hasn't been something said, it's been what hasn't. Because somewhere inside the royal system, something was triggered. And when that happens, the silence isn't empty, it's loaded. For months, the story followed a familiar pattern, a new appearance, a new project, another round of commentary, another promise that more was coming. The narrative never really slept. It just shifted platforms. But recently, people who track this world for a living started noticing something strange. Not a disappearance in the literal sense. Appearances still happened. Headlines still existed. But the reactions didn't. The usual machinery failed to turn on. No rapid palace pushback. No strategic sources say. No carefully timed counter leaks. Just a vacuum. And in the royal ecosystem, a vacuum is never neutral. Because this institution doesn't fight like celebrities do. It doesn't rush, it doesn't spar in public. When it speaks, it calculates. And when it doesn't, it usually means something internal is shifted. Watchers began comparing timelines. Media cycles that normally triggered responses now passed untouched. Speculation that once would have been quietly redirected was allowed to sit. And that absence of movement started to feel heavier than any statement ever could. The question quietly forming wasn't, what's the next reveal? It was, why isn't anyone stopping it? Why would an institution that survived abdications, wars, and scandals suddenly choose stillness at a moment when pressure was supposedly peaking? Because there's only one reason a system built on control allows uncertainty to spread. It believes the advantage has already changed hands. And once that idea takes hold, the story is no longer about what might be said next. It becomes about what's already been found. And that's where this stops being noise and starts becoming something else entirely. But to understand why this shift frightened even veteran royal watchers, you have to look at who the internet suddenly placed at the center of it. Not a king, not an heir, but the one royal who almost never speaks at all. Princess Anne was never supposed to be the headline. She doesn't give emotional interviews. She doesn't trade in symbolism. She doesn't cultivate mystery. She avoids it, which is exactly why her name suddenly appearing at the center of this narrative set off alarms. Because within royal culture, Anne occupies a role that almost never trends, but always matters. She is the keeper of continuity. The one deployed when situations stop being about image and start becoming about structure. While others manage perception, Anne is associated with process. Files, protocols, timelines, the mechanisms that sit underneath the crown. So when online speculation began shifting away from public figures and toward her, the story quietly changed categories. It moved from spectacle to systems. Viewers noticed that when rumor channels tried to explain the silence, they weren't pointing to press secretaries or legal teams anymore. They were pointing to archives, to sealed inquiries, to internal authority. And Anne's reputation made that pivot feel believable. Not because she's dramatic, because she's administrative. She's the royal most often described by insiders not as powerful, but as permanent. Someone who doesn't arrive to win moments, but to close chapters. The person associated with what happens after the cameras leave. So when her name became attached to words like review, file, and timeline, the tone of the conversation hardened. This wasn't about who felt wronged. It was about what could be documented. And once a story moves into documentation, it stops being a narrative war. It becomes an accounting. That's when the phrase that started circulating changed everything. Not interview, not statement. Dossier, a word that doesn't imply emotion. It implies inventory. But where did that idea come from? And why did so many people instantly accept it as plausible? To answer that, you have to understand the single real-world fact that rumor ecosystems build everything else on. And the idea of a dossier didn't come from nowhere. It didn't start with insiders. It started with a pattern. Royal watchers began pointing out something that had existed for years, but was suddenly being looked at differently. The quiet things that never got released. The reports that were acknowledged, then sealed. The inquiries that were confirmed, then buried. In most celebrity worlds, everything leaks eventually. In royal space, some things don't. And that absence became the breeding ground for everything that followed. Because when people know files exist but never see them, imagination fills the gap. And imagination always goes darker than reality. Online channels began stitching together old references, mentions of internal reviews, stories of complaints handled privately, statements that used phrases like confidential process and independent examination. None of it new, but now reframed, now reinterpreted, not as bureaucracy, but as buried material. And once that reframing took hold, the narrative shifted again. The silence stopped being seen as restraint. It started being seen as containment. Commentators claimed the palace wasn't refusing to respond because it was powerless. They were refusing because responses create discovery. And discovery is dangerous when records already exist. This is how the rumor ecosystem works. It doesn't invent from nothing. It builds on shadows, on acknowledgments without detail, on processes without outcomes. Every institution has them, but few institutions are as secretive, historic, and symbol-heavy as the monarchy, which makes it the perfect environment for this kind of story to grow. And soon, the question people were asking wasn't, what will be said next? It was, what has been sitting somewhere this entire time? Because once the public starts believing answers already exist, the entire conflict flips. It stops being about future accusations. It becomes about past records. And that's a much more dangerous game. That real-world detail was simple, and that's what made it powerful. There had, in fact, been internal reviews, processes that were publicly acknowledged and then never publicly unpacked, statements confirming examinations took place, headlines noting inquiries existed, and then nothing. No transcripts, no breakdowns, no releases, just the word confidential repeated and left to hang in the air. In most modern scandals, silence means collapse. In royal history, silence often means containment. And that distinction matters because it created the perfect psychological gap. Viewers knew something had happened, but they were denied the shape of it. And whenever human beings are denied shape, they create their own, slowly at first, then with obsession. The sealed nature of those processes became more influential than any allegation ever could, because now every new rumor didn't need proof. It only needed to point backward, to say, it's already there. This is why the story's gravity changed. The attention stopped clustering around future interviews and upcoming releases. It started orbiting old dates, old meetings, old timelines. People weren't waiting for new information anymore. They were hunting for missing information. And that shift is subtle, but it's everything. When a narrative becomes about what hasn't been shown, rather than what will be said, control quietly leaves the performer's hands. It moves to the institution. Because performers create moments, institutions create records. And once the public begins to believe, the truth lives in records, not reactions, the noise stops working, the oxygen changes. This is where the modern celebrity playbook begins to fail. Because outrage thrives on response, but archives don't respond. They outlast. And once that realization started spreading, the silence from London stopped looking empty. It started looking fortified, which led directly to the next turn in the story, because people stopped asking who was winning tea. This is where the conflict stopped resembling celebrity drama and started looking like psychological warfare, because the two sides were no longer playing the same game. One side moved through visibility, appearances, statements, projects, controlled vulnerability. The other side moved through absence. No interviews, no corrections, no public emotion at all. And in attention economies, absence can become dominance. The longer nothing came from London, the louder everything from California began to sound. Not stronger, thinner, repetitive, like sound bouncing in an empty room. This is the principle institutions have used for centuries. It's sometimes called gray rock. You don't escalate, you don't defend. You don't feed, you let momentum collapse under its own weight. And as days passed without response, viewers began noticing something else. The headlines didn't evolve. They recycled the same phrases, the same angles, the same speculation, repackaged. And when that happens, curiosity starts decaying into fatigue. This is the point where attention quietly migrates, not because minds were changed, but because interest was. And interest is power. The monarchy doesn't need to win belief battles. It only needs to outlast them, because time erodes narratives faster than any rebuttal ever could. That's why the silence began feeling less like hesitation and more like strategy. A refusal to grant relevance, a refusal to confirm the conflict even existed. And that denial does something devastating in media wars. It dissolves the villain. Without a visible opponent, stories lose shape. And without shape, they lose heat. Which raised the most unsettling possibility of all. What if this wasn't restraint? What if this was the beginning of disengagement? And if it was, the implications were far heavier than any interview ever could be. Because disengagement isn't about winning, it's about removing. As that possibility spread, another idea began circulating online. That somewhere inside the royal system existed a final switch. A legal or constitutional move so severe it could end the conflict in a single stroke. Titles, status, succession. The so-called nuclear option. But this is where rumor and reality violently separate. Because the monarchy is not a person. It is a lattice of law. And lattices don't move quickly. They require parliament, procedure, public consequence. There is no secret lever one royal can pull in a closed room. No instant erasure. No cinematic decree. Every structural change carries political weight and public cost, which makes the fantasy of a hidden execution button emotionally satisfying but strategically unlikely. Yet the persistence of that myth revealed something important. People weren't actually searching for punishment. They were searching for finality, for a sign that this endless loop had an endpoint. And when systems don't provide visible endpoints, audiences invent them. They create imagined closures, imagined files, imagined decisive acts. Because human attention cannot tolerate unresolved conflict forever. It needs resolution or release. The myth of the nuclear option wasn't about power, it was about exhaustion. Collective exhaustion with a story that never concluded. And that exhaustion redirected focus away from hypothetical punishments and towards something quieter but far more real. The slow removal of relevance. Because while laws are heavy in public, relevance is light and private. It doesn't require announcements, it only requires neglect. And neglect in narrative space is often more terminal than attack, which reframed the silence again. Not as a countdown to explosion, but as a test of disappearance. And that reframing forced a harder question. What if nothing dramatic was coming at all? What if this phase of the story had been designed to end not with exposure, but with evaporation? That question unsettled people more than any imagined revelation ever could. Because disappearance doesn't create heroes or villains. It creates irrelevance. And irrelevance is the one outcome no media-driven narrative can survive. The attention economy runs on contrast, on escalation, on reaction. Remove reaction, and even the most emotionally charged storyline begins to flatten. This is why the recent phase felt different to longtime watchers. Not quieter, emptier. The cycle no longer advanced. It looped, and loops signal decay. When institutions disengage, they aren't trying to dominate the conversation. They're trying to outlive it. They don't need belief. They need patience. The monarchy's power has never been in persuasion. It has always been in endurance. Outlasting governments, outlasting scandals, outlasting the people who once defined their eras. And once that framework became visible, the silence took on a new meaning. It wasn't waiting for the right words, it was waiting for interest to die. Because in modern conflicts, the side that controls attention controls memory, and memory is legacy. If this story stopped generating new angles, new developments, new tension, it wouldn't explode, it would fossilize. It would harden into background noise, and background noise is where narratives go to disappear. That realization reframed everything. The absence of a dramatic move was the move. The refusal to provide closure was the closure, which brought the entire saga to its most uncomfortable possibility yet, that nothing decisive would ever happen. No exposure, no confrontation, no verdict, just a slow public turning away. And that kind of ending doesn't crown winners. It erases players. And that is the ending no one was prepared for. Not a confession, not a collapse, not a dramatic reckoning, but a fade. Because in the end, the most powerful force in this entire story may not be law, lineage, or even truth. It may be attention itself. What we're watching now doesn't look like a war reaching its climax. It looks like a story running out of oxygen. The silence from London isn't building toward a spectacle. It's draining the stage. And stages without audiences don't host final acts. They go dark, which means the real question is no longer who was right, who was wrong, or who holds what file. The real question is simpler and far more uncomfortable. What happens to a narrative built on reaction when the reaction never comes? Because exposure can be survived. Criticism can be reframed, even scandal can be monetized, but being ignored cannot. And if this is the strategy now, then this saga won't end with a verdict. It will end the way institutions prefer all threats to end, not in flames, but in forgetting. So the choice isn't between voices anymore. It's between silences, the silence of an institution that can afford to wait, and the silence of a narrative that can no longer make itself heard. Which one do you think is more powerful? And which one actually ends a war? Let me know what you think in the comments.